Welcome to today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications. Now, let's dive into The Last Will, a story that proves sometimes the sins of the past have a way of catching up with those who think they've gotten away with everything. Elena Castellano sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Whitmore and Associates, her hands trembling as the family lawyer read her mother's final will and testament. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled family members, but none were harsher than the reality of what Elena was hearing. And to my daughter, Margaret Castellano Williams, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family mansion at 1247 Rosewood Drive, all financial assets totaling approximately $2.8 million, the family jewelry collection, and all business interests. Elena's world tilted on its axis. Across the polished table, her younger sister Margaret sat with perfect composure, her manicured fingers folded delicately in her lap. Not a flicker of surprise crossed her Botoxed features. Margaret had always been their mother's golden child, but this was beyond favoritism. To Elena Castellano, I leave my mother's old sewing box and the contents of the attic storage room with the hope that she will finally understand the value of hard work and humility. A sewing box. After 35 years of being the dutiful daughter, after caring for their ailing mother through her final illness, while Margaret lived her pampered life in the suburbs, Elena was being left with a sewing box. The lawyer's voice droned on, but Elena could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. She watched Margaret's lips curve into the faintest smile, not one of sympathy, but of satisfaction. "Are there any questions about the distribution of assets?" Mr. Whitmore asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "There must be some mistake. My mother always said the house would be split between us. She promised—" "I'm afraid the will is quite clear, Miss Castellano," the lawyer interrupted gently. "Your mother was of sound mind when she signed this document 6 months ago. Both Dr. Peterson and I can attest to that." 6 months ago? Elena's mind raced back. 6 months ago, their mother had been declining rapidly, confused and often not recognizing anyone. Elena had been there every day, feeding her, reading to her, managing her medications. Margaret had visited exactly twice. "Who witnessed the signing?" Elena asked, her voice growing stronger. "Mrs. Margaret Castellano Williams and her husband Robert Williams both signed as witnesses, as is perfectly legal since Mrs. Williams is not excluded from the will." Elena stared at her sister. Margaret finally met her gaze, and Elena saw something cold and calculating in those familiar blue eyes, something that made her blood freeze. "I'm sure this is difficult, Elena," Margaret said, in her practiced, sympathetic tone. "But Mother was very clear about her wishes. She felt that I had made better choices in life. Marriage, children, stability. She wanted to make sure her legacy went to someone who would honor it properly." The condescension in Margaret's voice was like a slap. Elena had sacrificed her own marriage prospects to care for their mother. She'd put her teaching career on hold, used her savings to pay for their mother's medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover, and given up years of her life to be the devoted daughter. And this was her reward. "If you'll excuse me," Elena said, standing abruptly, "I need some air." She walked out of the conference room on unsteady legs, leaving behind the murmur of voices and the sound of papers rustling. In the elevator, alone at last, Elena let the tears fall. But as she stepped out onto the busy downtown street, something shifted inside her. The grief began to crystallize into something harder, more focused: anger. Elena drove to the family home, now Margaret's house, and let herself in with the key she'd been using for years. The house felt different already, as if Margaret's ownership had changed its very atmosphere. She climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, where her inheritance waited. The storage room was dusty and cramped, filled with decades of accumulated memories. Old photo albums, her father's war medals, boxes of Christmas decorations, and in the corner, her grandmother's simple wooden sewing box. Elena lifted the lid and found exactly what she expected: spools of thread, packets of needles, measuring tape, and an old thimble. But as she lifted out the top tray, she noticed something else: a loose floorboard beneath where the box had been sitting. Curious, she pried up the board and found a metal strongbox hidden in the space below. Inside were documents that made her heart race: letters, photographs, and most importantly, a copy of her mother's original will dated 2 years earlier. In that will, the estate was split equally between both daughters, exactly as their mother had always promised. Elena's hands shook as she read through the other documents. There were letters from Margaret to various doctors, shopping around for one who would declare their mother mentally incompetent. There were records of Margaret's visits to their mother during Elena's brief absences, visits Elena had never known about. And most damning of all, there were photocopies of forged documents that had been used to manipulate their mother into signing the new will. Margaret hadn't just inherited everything, she had systematically stolen it. Elena photographed every document with her phone, her mind already working through the implications. She now had proof that Margaret had committed fraud, elder abuse, and quite possibly forgery. But she also knew that proving it in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Margaret had always been the smarter sister, the one who planned ahead and covered her tracks. Taking her to court would be playing by Margaret's rules, and Elena had already lost that game once. But Elena had something Margaret didn't expect: nothing left to lose, and a burning desire for justice. Over the next week, Elena began her investigation in earnest. She contacted every doctor, lawyer, and financial advisor their mother had worked with in her final years. What she discovered was a pattern of manipulation that was both sophisticated and cruel. Margaret had been systematically isolating their mother from anyone who might question the changes to her will. She'd convinced their mother that Elena was only interested in her money, that Elena's devotion was fake, and that Margaret's infrequent visits were actually more meaningful because they were quality time. Margaret had also been drugging their mother. The medical records Elena obtained showed that their mother had been on several medications that could cause confusion and memory loss. Medications that had been prescribed by a doctor Margaret had found, not their mother's longtime physician. But Elena's most shocking discovery came when she spoke to their mother's former housekeeper, Rosa Martinez, who had been mysteriously fired 3 months before their mother's death. "Your sister, she was evil to your mother," Rosa told Elena over coffee at a small cafe. "She would come when you weren't there and say terrible things. She told your mother you were stealing from her, that you were planning to put her in a nursing home. Your poor mother, she was so confused, so scared." "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena asked. "I tried to call you, but Miss Margaret, she said you were the one who wanted me fired. She said you thought I was stealing. I believed her because she seemed so concerned about your mother. But then I saw how your mother cried after her visits, and I knew something was wrong." Rosa's testimony would be crucial, but Elena knew she needed more than just witness accounts. She needed to expose Margaret in a way that would be impossible to cover up or explain away. Elena spent the next month developing her strategy. She'd learned a few things about deception from watching Margaret operate, and she was ready to use those lessons. First, Elena contacted a private investigator to help her gather additional evidence. What they found was that Margaret's perfect life wasn't so perfect after all. Her marriage was in trouble, her husband's business was failing, and she had significant debts that the inheritance would conveniently solve. Elena also discovered that this wasn't Margaret's first time manipulating an elderly relative. Their great-aunt had mysteriously changed her will shortly before her death, leaving Margaret a substantial sum that should have gone to charity. The pattern was clear. Margaret was a predator who targeted vulnerable family members. But Elena's masterstroke was yet to come. She'd been quietly researching Margaret's social circle and had discovered something interesting. Margaret's best friend, Caroline Morrison, was married to a prominent estate attorney who specialized in challenging fraudulent wills. Elena arranged to accidentally encounter Caroline at their mother's favorite restaurant, where she broke down in tears while telling her story. She carefully let slip details about the forged documents and Margaret's systematic abuse of their mother, framing it all as her desperate grief over losing both her mother and her sister's love. Caroline was horrified. Within days, the story had spread throughout Margaret's social circle. Elena made sure to follow up with several other influential friends, always presenting herself as the heartbroken daughter who just wanted to understand why her mother had turned against her. The Whisper campaign was devastating. Margaret's reputation in her wealthy suburb began to crumble as people realized what she had done. Her children's private school started asking uncomfortable questions. Her husband's business associates began distancing themselves from the family. But Elena saved the best for last. She'd discovered that Margaret was planning a lavish memorial service for their mother at the country club, using it as an opportunity to show off her inherited wealth and consolidate her position in high society. Elena decided to make her own memorial service, one that would tell the truth about their mother's final years. She rented the community center where their mother had volunteered for decades and invited everyone who had actually known and loved their mother. She displayed photos of their mother's volunteer work, her community involvement, and her life of genuine service. She invited Rosa Martinez to speak about their mother's kindness to her employees. She asked their mother's longtime friends to share memories of her generosity and wisdom. But the centerpiece of Elena's memorial was a video she had created, featuring interviews with everyone who had witnessed Margaret's manipulation of their mother. Rosa's testimony about the cruel things Margaret had said, the doctors who had raised concerns about the unnecessary medications, the neighbors who had seen Margaret's sporadic and brief visits compared to Elena's daily devotion. Elena didn't directly accuse Margaret of fraud. She simply let the evidence speak for itself. The video went viral on social media. Local news stations picked up the story. Within days, the contrast between Elena's humble, truthful memorial and Margaret's flashy country club event became a symbol of authentic versus fake values. Margaret's reputation was in ruins, but Elena still had one more card to play. She'd been quietly gathering support from other victims of inheritance fraud, and together, they had contacted the district attorney's office. Armed with Elena's evidence and similar cases involving Margaret, the DA decided to open a criminal investigation. Margaret was arrested 2 months after their mother's death, charged with elder abuse, fraud, and forgery. The case made headlines as an example of how wealthy families could prey on their own vulnerable members. During the investigation, more evidence emerged. Margaret had been systematically stealing from their mother for years, using her power of attorney to transfer money to her own accounts. She'd sold their mother's jewelry and replaced it with cheap copies. She'd even been forging their mother's signature on documents for over a year. But Elena's revenge was more complete than just seeing Margaret face criminal charges. The publicity around the case had attracted the attention of Margaret's wealthy neighbors and social circle. They began to re-examine their own elderly relatives' wills and financial arrangements. Several other cases of inheritance fraud were discovered, all leading back to Margaret's influence and advice. Margaret's husband filed for divorce, taking their children and claiming he had been unaware of his wife's criminal activities. Her friends abandoned her. Her perfect suburban life disintegrated completely. The civil lawsuit to recover the stolen inheritance was successful, but it revealed that Margaret had already spent much of the money on her lifestyle and debts. Elena would recover the house and some of the assets, but not the millions Margaret had squandered. However, Elena discovered something more valuable than money: the truth about her mother's real feelings. Hidden among the documents Margaret had tried to destroy were letters their mother had written but never sent. Letters expressing her love for Elena, her gratitude for Elena's sacrifice, and her confusion about why Margaret was telling her such terrible things about her devoted daughter. "My dearest Elena," one letter read, "I don't understand what's happening to my mind, but I know my heart. You have been my angel, my constant companion, my source of strength. If something happens to me, please know that you were the daughter who truly loved me, not because of what I could give you, but because of who I am. I'm so sorry if I've seemed distant or confused. I love you more than words can say." Elena wept when she read those words, but they were tears of healing, not grief. Margaret was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution, but her real punishment was the complete destruction of the life she had built on lies and manipulation. Elena used her restored inheritance to establish a foundation that helped elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse by family members. She became an advocate for elder rights and worked with law enforcement to identify and prosecute inheritance fraud. The family house became a resource center where seniors could get free legal advice about estate planning and protection from predatory relatives. Elena moved back into her childhood home, but she transformed it from a monument to wealth into a center for community service, exactly what her mother would have wanted. Margaret tried to contact Elena from prison, asking for forgiveness and claiming she had been desperate and mentally ill. Elena read the letter once and then threw it away without responding. Some betrayals were too deep for forgiveness, and some justice was worth waiting for. 2 years later, Elena received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Margaret's release from prison and her current situation: living alone in a small apartment, working as a clerk in a discount store, estranged from her children and ex-husband. Also in the package was a note: "You destroyed my life over money. I hope you're happy." Elena smiled grimly as she read it. Margaret still didn't understand that it had never been about the money. It had been about truth, justice, and protecting the memory of a mother who deserved better than to have her final years manipulated by a daughter who saw her only as a source of wealth. Elena framed the note and hung it in her office at the foundation, next to a photo of her mother volunteering at the local food bank. It served as a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's making sure they can never hurt anyone else the way they hurt you. Margaret had gotten exactly what she deserved: a life as empty and cold as the heart that had driven her to betray her own family. Elena, meanwhile, had found something Margaret never could: the peace that comes from living with integrity and the satisfaction of turning personal pain into protection for others. Sometimes the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And sometimes the daughter who gets nothing in the will ends up with everything that truly matters. 5 years after Margaret's conviction, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at the foundation. A young woman named Sarah Williams, Margaret's daughter, stood nervously in the doorway, clutching a manila envelope. She had grown into a striking young woman, but her eyes held the same calculating intelligence that Elena remembered from Margaret. "Aunt Elena," she said carefully, "I think you should see this." Inside the envelope were documents that made Elena's blood run cold. Evidence that Margaret had been planning her scheme for over a decade, including detailed notes about how to manipulate elderly relatives and a list of other family members she intended to target after their mother. Sarah explained that she had found the documents while cleaning out her childhood room after her father's recent death from a heart attack. Stress-related, the doctors said, brought on by the scandal and divorce. "I've been living with the shame of what my mother did," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But I realized that staying silent makes me complicit. There are other people she hurt, other families she destroyed, and they deserve justice too." The documents revealed that Margaret had been part of an informal network of inheritance fraudsters, sharing techniques and even referrals among wealthy suburban social circles. Elena studied the evidence with growing horror and determination. Margaret's crimes were far more extensive than anyone had realized. She had helped orchestrate the financial abuse of at least 8 other elderly relatives and family friends, netting hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Some of these victims had died in poverty, believing their ungrateful families had abandoned them, never knowing they had been systematically robbed by people they trusted. Working with Sarah and a team of investigators, Elena spent the next year building cases against Margaret's entire network. The investigation revealed a sophisticated operation that targeted wealthy elderly people across 3 states, using a combination of social manipulation, document forgery, and strategic isolation from protective family members. Margaret, even from prison, had been coaching other fraudsters through smuggled communications, turning inheritance theft into a profitable criminal enterprise. The expanded investigation led to 17 additional arrests and the recovery of over $3 million in stolen assets. Elena ensured that every penny went back to the victims' families or to elder protection organizations. Margaret's sentence was extended to 12 years, and she was transferred to a maximum security facility where her communications were strictly monitored. Sarah, despite the pain of testifying against her own mother's associates, became a powerful advocate for inheritance fraud victims and eventually joined Elena's foundation as a program director. On the 10th anniversary of their mother's death, Elena and Sarah stood together in the memorial garden they had created behind the family home, now the headquarters of the Elena Castellano Foundation for Elder Protection. Margaret's crimes had created ripples of pain that extended far beyond their family, but those same ripples had also created waves of protection and justice that would shield countless other vulnerable elderly people. Elena had learned that the best revenge wasn't just exposing one criminal, it was dismantling an entire system of abuse and replacing it with something better. Thanks for listening to today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications.